The Lambert family are back after 10 years. The last time we saw them, Josh and Dalton Lambert were hypnotised to suppress the memories of the horrors of the first two films by demonologist Elise. With the return of the Insidious franchise in Insidious the Red Door, did the Lamberts finally escape the ghosts of the past, and just how did Patrick Wilson do in his directorial debut? Hello one and all, I hope you're all doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. Today, however, we're just talking about new horror as we are talking about and reviewing the brand new Insidious installment, The Red Door, which was released worldwide on the 7th of July. I'm first going to talk about how The Red Door came to be, a little bit about the production, then I'll do a short spoiler-free review for those of you who haven't seen the film yet, and perhaps on the fence as to whether you should or not. And then I'll get into my spoiler review where I'll talk about the film in more depth, but I will give a warning for when we get to the spoilers, and I will also timestamp each section. And we're just going to ignore and casually breeze past the fact that this is actually the second time I am filming this video because for some reason my camera decided to delete the last one. Take two. Back in October 2020, it was announced that there was going to be a fifth installment in the Insidious franchise that would act as a direct sequel to Insidious and Insidious Chapter 2 and be in the same world as Chapter 3 and The Last Key. It was also announced that longtime member of the Insidious family, Patrick Wilson, would be directing in his directorial debut. The first two Insidious films were directed by James Wan, the third film was directed by co-creator and writer Leigh Whannell, while the fourth film was directed by Adam Robitel. Patrick Wilson, of course, plays husband and father Josh Lambert in the first two films, and is a regular leading man for James Wan, also starring in The Conjuring and the Aquaman films. Wilson has always been vocal about being proud of being a part of the Insidious movies. He's always been happy to revisit the character because of the quality of the stories. But when talking to Digital Spy about taking over as director, he said, quote, "I didn't know if I wanted to feel like I was stepping into the shoes of who I think is two of the greatest creators in Leigh and James, who have defined horror for me in the past 15 years." End quote. But as we know, Wilson eventually agreed to helm the new film and has said he's, quote, "honoured and thrilled." He also said, quote, "Directing the movie is both professionally and personally a full circle moment for me, and I am extremely grateful to be entrusted in continuing to tell this frightening and haunting story." End quote. The Red Door marks the first Insidious film to not have a screenplay written by Leigh Whannell. This time the screenplay is written by Scott Teems, who has previously written Halloween Kills and the Firestarter remake that came out last year. However, the screenplay is still based upon a story by Leigh. James Wan and Leigh Whannell, co-creators of Insidious, are still involved as producers, along with Jason Blum and Oren Peli. And Joseph Bishara returns as the film's composer, having done all previous films in the franchise. And if you saw my episode on Insidious's lipstick-faced demon, and if you haven't, what are you doing? Go check it out. Then you will also know that the demon is played by composer Bishara. If you haven't seen that episode, then I will leave a link to it here and in the description box. Okay, so let's get into the spoiler-free review of The Red Door. Now, this is going to be short and sweet. The Red Door is a film that does manage to feel like a natural progression of the Lambert story and a pretty organic addition to the franchise for the most part. It has its own style and flavour, but also pays respect and nods to the rest of the films. As far as scares go, there are a couple of really good ones. The film does follow the blueprint of scares from previous films, so you have the usual peripheral scares, and a build-up of an eerie feeling, but as always there are also plenty of jump scares. I think that Patrick Wilson does a solid job as a first-time director, and it definitely makes sense to revisit the Lamberts after 9 or 10 years. There is a story to tell there that doesn't feel like it's just shoehorned in to make a movie to make money. I will say stay till the end of the credits. It's only very short, but there is an end credit scene which you may be interested to see. Overall, I would say that The Red Door is worth your time and an enjoyable watch, especially since how the runtime is only about 1 hour 45, and we love films that aren't 3 hours long these days. Okay, so this is your warning for spoilers. From here on out, we're going to be talking in more detail about the film, and so spoilers will be included from here on out. You've been warned. When Insidious The Red Door was announced, it was described as being in the same universe as all 4 of the previous films, but was also a direct sequel to Insidious Chapter 2, following on from the Lamberts story. Now bear in mind that the last time we saw the Lamberts was 10 years and 2 directors ago, so how does The Red Door do at feeling like a natural sequel to Chapter 2 and an organic continuation of their story? Honestly, pretty well. It helps that all of the members of the Lambert family are played by the same actors. Everyone returned for their roles, including the children, so that helps it feel like we're genuinely revisiting the same family just years later. As far as does The Red Door feel as though it fits in the Insidious franchise overall, I'd have to say it does, but only to an extent. The first third of the film does not at all feel like an Insidious film, from the use of colour, the score, and just the overall feel of it. It feels different. I would say the score was probably the biggest element of making it feel different. Not only were all of the loud screechy sounds missing, but the usual score riffs were as well. I will say that in the last 2 acts of the film, it did gradually morph into a recognisable Insidious movie. There were the recognisable visuals such as the firth, the red door, and as the film progressed, the score gradually changed into the one of the first 2 films. More of it was dripped in as the story developed. The last 2 of the first 4 films, Chapter 3 and The Last Key, both felt slightly different from Chapter 1 and 2, but that was because they were different stories within the same universe, while Chapter 1 and 2 were literally 2 chapters of the same story, and The Red Door is supposed to be a continuation of that story. So I feel as though it's a little less acceptable for it to feel different. However, I will also make the point that The Red Door does still manage to be a kind of love letter to the previous films, tipping its hat and making nods to previous events and characters. A big part of this film feeling different has to be down to the fact that not only do we have a new writer, but we also have a new director in Patrick Wilson. So how did Wilson do in his debut? The Insidious franchise are films that Patrick Wilson feels very much at home in. These are films he knows and includes a cast and crew he has worked with and known for a really long time. He's built up strong professional and personal relationships with them. It's an incredible opportunity for your first outing as a director to be on a film that you know, that you love, and that has a team involved in it who want to help you succeed. Jason Blum has said that, quote, "One of the primary reasons the interest and appetite from fans has lasted for Insidious is because the people involved in the first film have stayed involved and kept it vital, interesting, and good. I'm so grateful to our collaborators on the franchise," end quote. So while James Wan and Leigh Whannell are neither directing or writing per se, they are still involved as producers and on hand. And James's advice to Wilson was apparently, quote, "Make it yours, make it personal." Not that I am detracting from Wilson as a director in his own right. I think you just have to acknowledge what a fantastic first outing as a director this is for Wilson. When talking to GameSpot about his approach to The Red Door creatively, Wilson said, quote, "I really wanted to unpack the second movie and address the trauma. That's the only way that I knew how to make a movie that I was passionate about, that I felt like I had any authority to make. So luckily, I'm surrounded by people that are long-time collaborators and knew that they would trust me and be here for questions and help, and which of course I used. Because I think it's important. This is very collaborative. It's a team sport. So it was a real gift really to have my first one out of the gate be such a successful franchise, such a built-in audience, but the creative ability to push the boundaries a little and do a different type of movie, but one that still honoured the legacy. So that's what I wanted to dig into," end quote. Lynn Shay, who plays demonologist Elise, said that Patrick was, quote, extraordinary, and his new role of him as director was pretty astonishing, end quote. And Ty Simpkins, who plays his son Dalton, has also spoken highly of Patrick as a director, describing him as both calm and specific. For me personally, I think Wilson actually did a pretty good job. He has a nice eye for shots and makes great use of the set spaces. And there is a level of calmness to the action taking place on screen for a lot of the time. It's often very subtle and minimalised. The problem is that he is, as he said, filling rather big shoes in James and Lee, and it is noticeable that he's not quite at that level. However, to say that, like Lee in chapter 3, he's directing and acting, and I just think, hats off to the guy. Because taking on this new role and revisiting a character he's not played in 10 years is a huge feat. As far as returning as Josh, I was blown away by what a great job he does. This isn't the exact same Josh we left 10 years ago, and that's how it should be. This is a character that is now older, he's lost his wife, lost his mum. It makes sense that he's changed and that there are differences. I loved this version of Josh. He feels almost weaker, slightly lost and broken. His brain has been foggy, as he calls it, since his memories were suppressed, and he's struggling to deal with that. The Red Door takes place 9 years after the events of chapter 2, and it opens with the funeral of Lorraine, Josh's mum. In the beginning scene, we learn that Josh and Renee have now divorced, and Josh is also alienated to a point from his children. We later learn that this is because the boys have fragmented memories of Josh trying to attack them while his body was possessed by Parker Payne, also known as the Bride in Black. The Insidious films have always been a family drama first and foremost, whether it's the Lamberts, the Brenners, Elise's family, or the one she builds with Specs and Tucker. Under all of the horror and the fantastical elements, there is always a family at the heart, and the Red Door's opening really reminds you of that. In this one scene, you have so much going on: grief, anger, distance. I mentioned earlier that the Red Door feels really different in the first act, and a huge part of this is because of the heavy lean into the family drama. It's a while before any of the horror kicks in, because we really get stuck into the family members, mostly Dalton and Josh, dealing with their issues and traumas from the past, their loss of memory, their confusion over certain events, their estrangement from one another, and the trauma is played on really heavily. It's a multi-generational thing, as we have the introduction of Josh's dad, who we haven't previously met or have had mentioned, but it's explained that his dad was also an astral projector who at the time felt like he was mentally ill, and who Lorraine, his wife, didn't feel able to help, as she didn't understand what was happening. We also learn that Josh's dad, Ben, took his own life by jumping off a hospital roof in the hopes of ending what he believes to be a curse. Josh's character feels very much defined by the absence of his dad, and when he discusses the fact that he didn't know his dad, and at least he's around for Dalton, Dalton says that he won't be defined by Josh like Josh is by his own dad. There's this history repeating itself, the astral projection gift being passed down through the generations, causing more and more pain. So we have the parallels between Josh's dad, Josh and Dalton, but then we also have the parallels drawn between Josh's dad thinking he was mentally ill, and because Josh doesn't know his memories have been suppressed, there is the question raised that perhaps that is also the cause of his brain fog. Now, all too often, mental health is used in horror to create a villain, which, let's just say it, that's not okay, but that isn't the case here. Instead, what Red Door does is ever so slightly touch on mental health and how scary that can be at times. When you're confused, you've got missing memories, or are confused by what's happening to you in your own head, or even physically. Think about if you feel anxiety. Without information about what's happening, it can feel really very scary. So there's this exploration of trauma and mental health, but using the further as the tool to do so. A lot of the focus on the Lamberts this time is on Dalton. It's as though the film is now passing the story on to the next generation. I also have to say that I like the addition of Renee and Josh being divorced, because that feels like a natural progression of that relationship. Even before all of the stuff with the further, that relationship was on the rocks, and I imagine having your husband attack you and your children, even if it isn't really him. I imagine that's really hard to come through afterwards. I did wonder why we had the addition of Josh's dad all of a sudden, with all of this information on him and Josh's overemphasis on how his dad shaped him but has never been mentioned before, but it made sense by the end of the film. This addition was for Josh's story at the end. Apparently all Josh has ever wanted is to be a good dad, to not be like his own dad. And in the final scenes of the film, we see Josh decide to sacrifice himself to save Dalton. That's why all this information was added, so that Josh could have this redemption moment, which wasn't actually needed in the end, as Dalton saved him after he'd saved Dalton by sealing the red door, but it was still important for his character to go through that moment. Even if you've not seen the Insidious films, you've probably seen footage of the infamous jump scare from the first film, where the lipstick-faced demon appears, behind Patrick Wilson's Josh. It sits in many a best scare of all time lists, and rightly so. And the 3 sequels have all delivered many great scares as well. And apparently, Wilson knew the importance of scaring an Insidious audience, but at the same time didn't want to tread old ground, repeating the same scares that we've seen. He said in a Digital Spy article, quote, "I wanted different kinds of scares because that's what appeals to me. Yes, we've got some jump scares. I also wanted just some eerie moments, some more tonal scares. I wanted to scare in the daytime." End quote. So, do the scares in the Red Door work? Well, yeah, they do, because they very much follow the blueprint of previous Insidious scares. I understand Wilson saying that they didn't want to do the same scares, but to me that appears to be a literal copy, because the scares are like previous scares. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the scares work. All of the scares are real scares. There are no fake outs, which I always appreciate. And we still have the, peripheral scares. The ones where something is in the corner of your eye or lurking in the background, which sets up the eerie feeling and builds to the big scare payoff, usually a jump scare. I will say that there are 2 scares that I really enjoyed, and they actually follow one another, just like boom, boom, scare, scare. So the first one is when Dalton is in the art class and he's lost in the zone, drawing the red door. I loved everything about this scene. The image of him drawing, the chaos of the black charcoal, the score with the culmination of the jump scare, the demon's hand grabbing Dalton, which then leads to his blood turning the door red. Then we have Josh having an MRI scan, which is terrifying in itself, really. But the use of sound in that scene, the way they just really crank up the humming of the machine, and then cut to black. And then there's this hand just reaches down to Josh's shoulder. It's simple, quiet, awesome. Of course, we then get a build up to the ghost crawling up the MRI tube, but for me, the hand is the best and most effective bit. I will say, as far as scares and ghosts go, we really did not need the puking ghost. What the hell was that? It was like it was out of Scary Movie or something. It felt really out of place, it wasn't really expanded on, and in my opinion just wasn't needed. One positive is that we get to visit the further earlier in this film, and we are back to the further of the first 3 films before they stripped it back to the basic pieces of our world in the 4th film. So it's a full copy of rooms and buildings. But I would say the best parts of the further aren't shown till later, when we get to revisit the lair of the lipstick-faced demon. And what I love about the demon's lair is that, yes, there are plenty of recognisable aspects that they've brought back, including the song Tiptoe Through the Tulips, but the demon has made some additions in the last 9 years. He's made little model scenes of events from the first film, which just feels really eerie and stalkery to me. It's like he's been sat there obsessing over getting Dalton, which he does eventually. I mentioned that the red door nods to previous films, so we have the return of the lipstick-faced demon and the bride in black. And while I've heard some people say that it wasn't the lipstick-faced demon who was returning, I think it should be the lipstick-faced demon. There is no other option. This demon has been set up as the big bad in the franchise and is firmly from the Lamberts past. Could we have got, if I'm being really picky, a little bit more time with the lipstick-faced demon? Yeah, we probably could. However, This is the first time we see him succeed in possessing someone, and I think that when he has possessed Dalton, that is really good. That's kind of worth the wait. As we are visiting the same place in each of the films, I appreciate it when they add in a little bit of new lore to it to help expand on it, and they do that again in The Red Door. This time we learn that the entities in the further are stuck there, doomed to repeat their worst mistake over and over. We already know that the entities are trapped in time, and to know it's the worst moment in time from your life is horrifying. Imagine your afterlife being your worst mistake lived over and over again. I knew going into The Red Door that Lynn Shay was reprising her role as demonologist Elise. I mean, she's on some of the posters, but I didn't know how they were going to use her. I'm not sure I love the direction they went with. It's a YouTube video of her, I assume, talking to a class about the further, but it was a bit odd, a little bit random, and I think it was only there for Dalton and his roommate Chris to get information about the further. And I guess to inform a new generation of audience members who perhaps haven't seen the other 4 films. I'm not sure it's the best use of this awesome character, but it was nice to have her back at least. She does pop up again at the end, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. We also have a nice cameo from Carl, who was in chapter 2 and 3, again bringing characters back from previous movies. Now, I was really disappointed when Specs and Tucker weren't to return. They are my favourite characters and a huge source of enjoyment for me watching the movies. But oh boy, well done The Red Door for keeping that little secret, because it was such a wonderful surprise when their little cameo happened. I knew it was coming. I don't know why, Chris and Dalton sat down at the laptop and I just went, So they appear in a YouTube video explaining what astral projection is. It's short and sweet, but honestly, it was just such a wonderful surprise that I don't even care. It's honestly better than nothing. So we have Scott Teems writing the screenplay for The Red Door. The first time we've not had a script from Winnell, but honestly, you can still feel his writing in the film. There is the staple Winnell illness, mortality and life and death that you find in a lot of, in fact, most of his films. He always does a great job of morphing real-life fears of illness into fantastical horror films. In terms of story, I would say that The Red Door is a little bit like Chapter 2, where you have the 2 stories running side by side, which ultimately combine at the end. And like in Chapter 2, one of the stories is a little bit investigative, where you have Josh investigating what's wrong with him, but also into his father. There's also the staple of Insidious movies where you revisit a past event to see it from a different perspective. I always love it when they do that. It never feels a stretch to create these links and weaves in the characters and the further's past. My favourite aspect of the story is how they use Dalton's art class as a way to explore his trauma and hidden demons and darkness, as it was. In the first film, Dalton communicated so much through his drawings that this makes sense as a natural progression for the character, and those scenes with his art teacher are just so interesting, talking about light and shadow, balance of darkness and light, about putting your heart and soul, your experiences into your art. It's a real form of therapy using art, and I find it fascinating. I just wish they'd delved a little more into this or used it a little more. And I really like how there is a parallel between the drawing art that they're talking about in the film as a way to explore your experiences, to put your heart and soul into it. But, they can also be talking about film as art, creating that art to put your heart and soul into and to explore your own demons and darkness. I did feel as though the ending was at first just repeating the ending of the first Insidious. So you have Josh rescuing Dalton, ghosts gathering around the empty human vessels, and Josh in an armchair flinching about as he suffers in the further. And it just didn't seem right at first. It seemed a little lazy. But again, like the inclusion of Josh's dad, this choice did make sense, in that it's to show how the characters have changed over the years, how they've changed since that first film. The Red Door ends on a family. After all the further stuff and red-faced demons, the end of the story is about the Lamberts, because like I said, that's what Insidious is about. Family. In the end, we do get another appearance from Elise, which confused me at first, and maybe still does. I did wonder, maybe I'm the only one here, I did wonder if Josh was actually dead or still in the further, because there are cryptic things said, like Elise saying keep a steady stride to Josh, which is something that she said earlier in the film when talking about the further. She also says something about something flooding the mind with memories, which is a callback to Carl saying death floods the mind with memories at the beginning of the film. I don't know. There was just something odd about that bit. Could just be that Josh can see spirits and the gift hasn't been suppressed this time, so perhaps he's alive and just seeing Elise's spirit. I don't know. Let me know your take. The end credits song is awesome. It's a cover of Stay by Shakespeare's Sisters from the 80s, and it's now done by Ghost and special guest Patrick Wilson. So good. I've had it on repeat ever since I saw the film. So, there you go guys, my review of Insidious the Red Door. I'm sorry it's such a long one. I did not intend it to be so long. I thought it'd be like 10 minutes, but turns out I had a lot to say. My overall thoughts on The Red Door are that this is a good film. For me, it is a solid 3.5 stars out of 5, and on my Letterboxd review, a little heart as well. For the 5th entry, and Wilson in his directorial debut, I think it's great. Is it perfect? No, not by a long shot, but it's scary, it's enjoyable, and it's respectful to the franchise it belongs in. Not all sequels can say the same. I will admit, I was worried when I heard that it was Scott Teems writing it, as I've not been a huge fan of his most recent films. I'm looking at you, Firestarter. But honestly, I think it's hard to mess up writing a film when you're writing a world that is so well built and established, when you're writing a story laid out by people who know the films and characters so well. I can imagine people having mixed reviews on this one though. I don't think everyone will love it, but you know, that's okay. I would love to know your thoughts down below in the comments if you've seen the film already. Maybe because it's such a new release, maybe put spoiler warning if you're going to include spoilers in your comments. Let's be fair, let's be nice, not everybody has seen it yet. So yeah, maybe just give a little warning. Also, if you're new here and found me through this episode and enjoy horror or enjoy Insidious, then make sure you're subscribed, because next week I will be talking about the franchise as a whole and including my own personal ranking of all 5 films. And like I said, if you haven't seen it yet, I have already done an episode on the lipstick face demon, which I will leave a link to in the description box, so also check that out. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye.